Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word in danger of losing its meaning altogether. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and this week I'm joined by Collin Graves, CEO of North Labs, a leading fractional cloud data analytics firm that has empowered over 1,000 organizations with data-driven strategies. Before founding North Labs, he served with distinction in NATO Special Operations during his tenure with the U.S. Air Force. Collin, it's such an exciting opportunity to speak with you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, likewise, Jared. Thanks for having me.
Let's dive right in. What, to your mind, is innovation?
I had a hard time thinking about this because I read through your previous episodes and I read all of the different variety of answers people have given in the past, which is really cool. I want to go a little counterintuitive here and say, I think innovation is simplifying. I think that is my core. When I think about what innovation brings, at least in the form that my organization does for industrial organizations, for manufacturing organizations, typically the sort of gold buried underneath the ground is how do we simplify a process to make it operate more efficiently, faster, with fewer mistakes, or with fewer bits of human input, manual input. And so as I was reading through your list of titles, I started challenging myself to think, okay, yeah, it's progress, it's building something great, but I think I'm going to stick with innovation is simplifying.
I love that. Yeah, it's a simple answer. So it's almost self-referential, right? You've simplified all the other answers that came before into a simple answer. I think simplification is underappreciated in the modern world. There's an elegance that comes from taking things that are complex and distilling them to the necessities. You think about music, you think about Miles Davis. In art, you think about Picasso. They used very few notes or very few strokes to convey a story, and that is often much harder than doing it the traditional way. What's the value in taking that more difficult route to get to that simplicity?
Yeah, it's a good question. Another example I thought of too was think of the most valuable company on earth right now in Apple. Their entire design thesis was around taking a modern PC, a modern audio interface, a modern cell phone, and making it elegant, simplifying the design, simplifying the number of moving parts, and really making it more user-friendly. Now, I'm not going to come in here and say that my organization makes manufacturing and industrial processes more, like Apple, where it's just beautiful.
Okay.
But you're totally right. There's an inherent air toward complexity in business. I've been working in the tech space for a long time. And whether I was a part of software engineering teams or machine learning teams or running my own businesses, there's a tendency to always be additive in your thought process. What can we add? If I just add this 100th tool to my organization's SaaS portfolio,
right,
it'll accomplish some task for us. But eventually there comes a point of not only diminishing returns, but arguably negative returns, where the complexity becomes overwhelmingly the burden on the organization to thrive. So just like how an artist thinks about painting as negative space, or a photographer thinks about a shot they're taking as negative space as much as positive space, I think that plays a big role in any conversation around innovation. What can we remove in order to truly experience what we're trying to add? Because if we're just glomming stuff on top of each other, eventually that tower of matchsticks and bubblegums becomes very tipsy. So when we talk about that investment piece, the work comes in, okay, can we remove some technical debt from the process that has existed in the past? Can we remove some of the manual pieces that are truly undifferentiated in nature? What do I mean by that? People have to do it as part of the process, but it doesn't actually add value to the process. It doesn't add value to the person performing the task. How can we simplify those things away and get a lot more direct with that value thesis? That to me is self-explanatory. Of course, I'm in the business of selling that. So I'm the most biased person somebody can talk to in that regard. But that really, in my mind, promotes a bit of clarity. We sort of slow down to speed up. We smooth out the rough edges. So at the end of the day, we have a more polished final product.
It's very close to my heart as well in terms of how I think about innovation and how I think about progress and life. To your point about adding that next thing, at some point, things that are value adding, even if they are value adding, they start to distract from each other. And they start to kind of erode the value that each individual component may have had on its own. And I really like your way of tying it back to value, because as you said, our knee-jerk reaction is to be additive. I think partly because, at least in Western culture, more is better. There's this underlying sort of, why have a 4-bedroom house if you can have a 5-bedroom house? Why have 2 cars if you can have 3 cars? Why have a sedan when you can have a gigantic SUV? And I think that thinking has started to permeate the way we internalize value. And I think it's making it even harder for people to have the clarity of thought and the vision that you're kind of pointing toward around simplification and value.
Yeah, it happens in our daily life and it happens in running a business. In my daily life, I used to be one of these guys. I spent a while in the military, and you have to have a solid sense of self in the military, especially if you're flying around with special operations, because you know you're the least cool person on the airplane at any given time. And when you kind of, resemble Harry Potter like I did back in my young days, I knew I was the least cool person surrounded by these amazing people every day. You have to develop an elevated sense of self, which can be great until it leaks into hubris, of course, or ego. At one point in my life, I had this mindset of, I want to be an expert in 10 different things. I want to be the best guitarist on the planet. I want to fly the most planes on the planet. I want to competitively shoot the most guns on the planet. All sorts of things. I want to race cars, and I want to do this and this and this. And eventually you get to a point with that additive philosophy where you go, I'm not good at any of these.
Right.
What happens if I simplify and just focus on 1 or 2 that sort of help balance my life? So music, and then sure, a technical pursuit like racing cars or driving cars really fast, that can promote balance. But we do this in business too. Most people think if I just had 1 more customer, my life would change. But what we don't realize is 20% of your worst performing customers are taking 80% of your team's time and attention because they need babysitting and hand holding, and you're always feeling like you're walking around with a little fire extinguisher. So when we think about that too, there's innovation in those systems thinking where you can look at something and go, what negative space could I create and have an equally beautiful, if not more beautiful, photo, painting, landscape at the end of it? It applies to life, it applies to business, and it's something that I'm still working on for sure, but it's something that I'm at least mindful toward in my day-to-day life, especially now. You get married, you have a family, that sort of thing. You can't be infinitely additive anymore.
Right.
You have to learn how to prioritize and balance yourself.
That's such an important message. And thank you for sharing the examples from your life, because I feel like sometimes when we're talking about business, we immediately want to go to external business analogies.
Right.
Or external benchmarks and things like that.
Right.
But in terms of professional development, especially as an entrepreneur or leader of a company, sometimes the best way to think about a challenge you're having at work is how you approach other aspects of your life.
Right.
Because that's the fewest degrees of freedom.
Right.
It's just the only difference is the context. So it's really important and great that you shared those examples and brought it back to the business context, because we can all do that. I'm thinking about in my life, where am I more or less additive? And how does that apply to the way I approach business? You mentioned a term a while back, tech debt. I wonder if you'd unpack that for the audience just a little bit, because I think there's probably some value in that in terms of thinking about simplifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I typically think about technical debt in terms of existing business systems or software. I know a lot of your past guests have backgrounds in systems development, software development, that sort of thing. Anytime we feel like we're rushing toward a final outcome, we tend to cut corners. And sometimes you have to. There's no such thing as perfect software. There's no such thing as perfect process. That should be well understood. And I am not advocating to the contrary, that you can magically have perfect software. Anyone listening to this knows that doesn't exist. But what ends up occurring based off of those shortcuts you take or those decisions you make, you accrue what we refer to as technical debt. This means, for this piece of the system, the process, the software, we sort of jumped over this gap, this chasm here, and it works. But that technical debt over time tends to compound because you're having to make special exceptions to that shortcut you took. Maybe it becomes the most brittle part of the system at scale. In a former life, I was a software engineer for a group that built out really early telemedicine capabilities in the healthcare world. So not only did we sort of help, I don't want to say pioneer, but we help advance the idea of virtual visits with doctors. We also spent time building out diagnosis support for clinicians to say, based off of Jared's inputs of how he's feeling, his symptoms, etc. Obviously, by law, you can't use AI or machine learning to actually diagnose, but it can be used as a guide for physicians. And that ended up creating a ton of technical debt because there were so many edge cases where a physician would go, you said there's a 70% likelihood that it's a cold, but I actually think it's something worse. And so it was an example where you make some shortcuts, you weigh things appropriately just to say you have that feature or whatever, and it doesn't end up being perfect. And the same goes for business process. And this goes back to simplifying. When I first started my company, North Labs, I had a long history with Amazon Web Services. I've been in that space for 17 years. I'm the old greyhound at the track. I've worked on 1,000 projects over the years. And when I started the company in 2016, it was my second company I had founded in that space. And I started out with this idea of, I don't care what industry you're in, I can help you build systems. So whether you're manufacturing or healthcare or higher education, I don't really care. I can help you. But what you come to find out is there's so many subtopics, sub-processes that occur if you're trying to sell so horizontally that it's really hard to get things locked in and keep that aperture sort of narrow. And so we ended up taking that horizontal plane and standing it upright and saying, okay, we are the data, automation, and AI partner for manufacturing and industrial. Now, industrial is wide-reaching. It could be oil and gas. It could be medical device, energy and utilities, whatever the case may be. But we now could come into a conversation going, okay, we have reason to believe this is going on within your company. This is what you're experiencing, and this is the impact it's creating on your business, either from a process standpoint or a financial standpoint. And here's how we typically look to address that. You can see how things sort of zoom in a bit, and it allows you to get more pointed. So I say all of this to say that that was technical debt for us at the company. Maybe some people would argue it's not technical. Maybe it's process debt, but it all applies the same. You're sort of making these exceptions and putting Band-Aids on parts of your system, parts of your process to accommodate retail, to accommodate higher education, whatever industry you're talking about. And it ends up becoming really brittle as you scale and ends up creating more work for your people to accommodate that process. So hopefully that makes sense.
It does make sense. Thank you for taking the time to kind of walk through that. I think it's such an important concept because I feel like it encourages people to think beyond the problem that's currently sitting on their desk. I feel like you accrue this technical debt, process debt, these other sorts of things, a lot of times through short-term thinking and short-term problem solving outside of a broader context. And so The innovation piece of it, I think when you have an eye towards simplification, gives you a broader context to say, yes, okay, this will save me X number of lines of code, or this will save me 48 hours and I can hit my arbitrary but absolutely can't miss launch date. And what does that mean for the future? What if 6 months from now we have 15,000 of these instead of 15 of them? What if 6 months from now we have 8 different versions of this instead of just this version? And I feel like if you're aware of that concept of technical debt, process debt, whatever other type of debt, product design debt, there's lots of different takes on it now. But if you're aware of that, you at least have the possibility that you might pause and say, wait a minute, before I check this box on my to-do list, what are some of the downstream and future potential implications?
Yeah, just pulling it into pure software, if we think about that for a second, most people will say, well, we have a target launch date, like you said. This has to get out the door. So we're just going to do this for the short term. We're going to build it this way for the short term, but we'll come back to it.
Right.
No one has ever come back to it.
No.
And the problem with that is the debt compounds relative to time and scale. So the exact thing where you wouldn't want debt to compound, more users on the platform, more customers being sold to, more load on the systems, is when that debt occurs. And when it comes time to pay that debt, typically they say it's anywhere between a 4x and 10x investment to fix the debt than the initial development cost.
Wow.
Now, I don't have any figures around process debt. I have to imagine that maybe it's not as crazy as that. But the fact of the matter is, if a business is scaling and the process doesn't fit the business or the people in the business, changing that process, I've lived through this, is immensely difficult. Getting people to sort of subscribe to new laws of physics within the business, doesn't have to be a software platform, is tough. And it takes a lot of time, attention, and frankly, opportunity cost to fix that debt, to repay that debt. Because while you're doing that, you're moving more slowly, you're making more mistakes, you're underserving your prospects, you're distracted by new ways of doing things and moaning with your colleagues on Slack or whatever that this new process is terrible. And so this is all sort of intangible, but directly affects the business's performance, just as technical debt in software affects the system performance over time.
Right. That's so well said. So the flip side of the coin of debt is sort of the ROI side of things in terms of the benefits. So simplifying allows you to avoid or to reduce the risk or likelihood of accruing this debt. Can simplification also increase or magnify the return, the potential return in an innovation context?
I think logic must necessarily say that it does. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Right now, I work in the cloud space, lots of data work, helping organizations improve their throughput efficiencies, improve their asset tracking, help get products made faster, get them out the door and delivered to their customers faster, avoid fewer items being thrown in the scrap heap because they didn't meet quality control stipulations, whatever that might look like. But we have topics today like AI, Gen AI. Everybody who's listening to this has heard the term. They've probably played with ChatGPT, what have you. I have not seen a bigger pull toward what I do since the advent of the cloud.
Oh.
To put this into perspective, because people see this and they say, oh my gosh, let me just apply Gen AI to everything in my business. And won't that be amazing? I won't even need employees anymore because everything's going to run on these magic sprinkles and it's going to be great. Now, that's fine. And typically I have customers come to me and say, here's my ideal end state. What will it take to build this out? So if I were to satiate their desires and say, great, we'll scope this for you, we'll get after it. It's going to be 4 years of work, but we're going to build this for you, Jared. What do you think is going to happen at some point during those 4 years and probably the first 4 months to that customer? The things that were unclear to them will now become more clear. They'll start to have different ideas of how to apply AI in the short term to potentially drive more impact for the business. And now they're on the hook for this 4-year engagement. Or they say, pause, now we need to stop, take a breath, reassess, realign, redeploy. When instead, what we typically say, and look, not to thump our chest, but a lot of the folks we sell against in the industry would go, great, let me get you that proposal. 4 years of work, that sounds awesome. Yeah. But we tend to, just like with the cloud back in 2010, 2012, when it became a lot more mainstream for organizations to move workloads to the cloud, that same sort of cycle occurred where everyone started out saying, I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's a 20-year-old IBM mainframe, get it to the cloud. And all that did was take that technical debt from an old system and move it to somewhere that was less receptive of hosting it and ended up costing them more money, whatever the case may be.
Right.
So instead, the attitude became, let's go slow. Let's sharpen our axe. Let's calculate. Let's get one thing moved up and see how it performs. And if it works well, let's grab 2 more things and move it up. And over time, we're going to complete this modernization effort. And that to me is simplicity. And that's where my industry is going to have to go over the next couple of years to say, I understand you want to apply AI to everything, but perhaps you shouldn't. And perhaps we should start with a very small use case, measure the value to the business against that use case. If it's positive, pour gas on that thing and let's get after it. If it doesn't work out, because we simplified, we're no longer in a position where we spent years and millions of dollars only to get something wrong.
That's so important, especially with the understanding of the back end of AI and all of the energy being consumed to bring this to life. So throwing everything at it in a haphazard, err on the side of AI, we'll figure it out later kind of approach, it literally has real world implications. The percentages of energy consumption by data centers are just skyrocketing. And so there's real implications to what you're describing, and there are real strategic implications to what you're describing. And businesses would do well to take that more incremental prototype, pilot, small test sort of approach, even as the broader world is sprinting headlong into this new world.
If you compare it back to the cloud piece, right? And I'm a vocal proponent of this industry. It's all I know, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Back in 2010, 2012, 2014, people were saying, if you don't get fully into the cloud tomorrow, you're going to go out of business. And we've proven that to be untrue over and over again.
Right.
Now, can it provide you with benefits? Of course it can, but it's not going to be the difference between life and death. We hear the same thing now with Gen AI. If you don't adopt Gen AI, Jared, you are out of business in 18 months. I guarantee it. But no one is in a position to do anything other than surface level Gen AI applications. What's the percentage of organizations out there whose data is so well collected, so well prepared, so trustworthy that they know they can stick an AI application on top of it and say, whatever output this AI comes up with, I will trust. I would argue less than 1% of businesses on the planet, because I'm in the business of working with muddy, nasty data every day. An organization saying, we don't even know how many widgets came off of our assembly line yesterday,
right?
Let alone predicting it, or let alone using AI to help drive the production of those widgets.
Right.
We're going to be in this period over the next 5, 7, maybe 10 years where people go, okay, that's the North Star. Let's work backwards from there and figure out where we need to first focus our attention. And all of that attention needs to be focused on that foundational piece. Is your data ingested well? Is it prepared and cleansed? And is it trustworthy? Because if you don't trust your data today and then you apply AI on top of it, what's that going to do? It's going to add an exponent to the untrustworthiness of your data.
Yes.
That will be a terrible waste of money. So that's really where we find ourselves today.
That's such an important point. As an engineer, it's near and dear to my heart. Data hygiene and garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
The amplification effects of correlations between and among spurious data points. And that amplification exponential kind of, okay, you go from not right to really completely wrong very quickly. And that's such an important point. It feels like, to your point, kind of with the cloud analogy, the move to the cloud analogy, at some point, there will be some sort of realization that in order to get the most out of this, we're going to have to do the dirty work that the big Gen AI companies have been doing for 10 years and not talking about. There's no shortcut. And it almost feels like the entire industry is incurring that technical debt that you talked about. And that bill is going to come due when the consequences of overlaying Gen AI over spurious, muddy data become apparent.
Yeah, we have the garbage in, garbage out concept, but also think about the tool sprawl that we have the potential to face. We're already in a position, I'll give you a statistic that I'm going to get mostly right. You'll get the magnitude of it. In 2016, in an average manufacturing organization, there were fewer than 50 software systems. Now, average between 100 million and 500 million in size, still a lot.
Sure, yeah.
In 2023, there were more than 130. So it's nearly tripled in size over the last 10 years. And what's going to happen now with Gen AI? If we don't have unified data, and we're just going to say, I'm going to piecemeal together different Gen AI platforms with different algorithms, with different training having occurred, and I'm going to layer these different laws of physics on different pieces of my data, how can you possibly unify around that as an organization?
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
Right.
It just can't happen. And so we're already in this tool sprawl sort of kerfuffle where the bill is going to come due. And that's making it harder for organizations to get started with this stuff because you have so much disparate data sitting in weird silos that you first need to collect, unify, prepare, and trust.
Right.
And now we're saying whether I use OpenAI's systems or I use Claude 3 or I use some Air AI to make phone calls, we don't know the training that's occurred within these systems and can't reasonably say that they're all subscribing to the same laws of physics, meaning they're all going to interpret my company's data, the stuff I trust or I'm working to trust, in different ways. They're going to make different inferences. They're going to make different decisions based off of the same data. All that's going to do is magnify the problems we have today when humans do that. But now you're doing it at a scale much higher than manual process. Now it's happening automatically and it's reinforcing itself. At least a human can say, nah, I was wrong with that. That doesn't pass the gut check. But an AI system isn't going to go, yeah, the sniff test doesn't check out. I'm just going to now commit this to memory and remember this for the next time. The next time I need to recall this bit of information. This is the bill that's going to come due, especially if we don't start very small and start with very trustworthy data.
Wow. What do you think the role of language is in this whole problem? I cannot recall such a broad brush being placed on an entire industry before. Just the term AI covers so many different types of tools, so many different levels in the build process, so many different ways of implementing, so many different types of interaction, so many different types of so much. It just encompasses so much. And I wonder about the role of that kind of under nuanced language in what you're describing and people's sort of 1849 gold rush kind of mentality. You know what I mean? Does that question make sense?
It does. And I just had a conversation about this last week with a colleague. I hate the term AI.
Yeah.
Not only because of that nuance you described, but because everyone qualifies it differently. And we all want to market to this idea that we're AI enabled. So there's a trident here that's going to stab us.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. You don't know what it is, but we're all claiming we do. And so that happens in politics all the time. But look how that stirs things up. I think Gen AI is generative machine learning. It's not intelligence. I wouldn't argue that it's intelligence. It's reinforcement learning that we've been doing in machine learning for a long time. You're saying you have your proverbial carrot to the donkey and you say, good boy, that was a good choice. Or nope, you don't get the carrot because you guessed it wrong. And pretty soon the donkey understands where I have to walk in order to get the carrot. That is not intelligence. That is reinforcement. And there are certainly applications of AI out in the market. Of course there are. We've got huge organizations that are building out vast neural networks and decision-making capabilities and robotics that are fully autonomous and everything like that. I would argue that's the closest thing we have to true artificial intelligence. But in terms of the context we talk about in business today, there's not intelligence, it's reinforcement learning. And we've had that with machine learning for eons. Now it's just happening for you in the background as opposed to you having to set up all the stuff. It's happening on its own and it's using a model to reinforce itself based off of how much context it can hold. So yeah, I think we're going to get into a dilemma where when we talk about the ethics of AI, which is a very real thing, and we already hear people talking about it, Congress talks about it, even the AI founders talk about it. How are we going to classify this stuff? Because that nuance means that the spectrum is so wide that we can't possibly lump everything into one topic. Are we going to really talk about autonomous robots and UAVs the same way we're going to talk about my ability to create a support chatbot on my website? It's not the same thing.
Right.
And that really is not to slight the people building great software, but it's just not the same application of what we consider this term to be.
It's different. Yeah. Right. It feels like growing up in school and things, there was always a teacher who taught science, a teacher who taught math, whatever, and a music teacher. And I was always like, what's a music teacher? You know what I mean? Like, are you teaching me music theory? Are you teaching me piano, voice, guitar, French horn? Like, what's a music teacher? So I think we're going to run into that, not only on the end where you live and have your deep expertise, but on the other end where people want to go leverage the technology and don't know how to ask for what they need, which I think is a bigger concern because it's really the clarity of the consumer and customer language that drives our capitalist innovation engine. If a customer can't articulate the problem they're trying to solve in terms of the tool they're looking for, it becomes a hammer in search of a nail. You have people who have patents and have miles and miles of servers and things saying, this is what you need because this is what I've invested in, is the implication, versus what I think pulls innovation through humanity is, there's food on the other side of that river. I'm hungry. How do I get onto the other side of that river? And I don't know if we have the language for AI at that fundamental level. It's been such an eye-opening conversation. My brain is just so full of questions and ideas and thoughts just around your central theme around simplifying. Before I let you go, I want to ask if you have any advice that you would offer to innovators.
Such a good question. Start with a well-understood problem statement and have the confidence and the diligence to quantify that problem statement. Because innovation without a problem and a problem without a well-understood impact of the problem means that you just have an idea. And we're all trying to innovate. We're all trying to push things along. And so if you think there's a need, work to understand that need, but don't just understand it qualitatively, understand it quantitatively as well. How much pain do your customers, does an industry, does the world feel with the problem? And once you can quantify that, now you work to understand, okay, what's the root cause of that problem that's driving that impact? And now you understand where to innovate. This is coming from a guy who has started something like 7 companies and 2 of them have worked out. The other 5, I would argue I didn't take the time to really understand the root cause. I maybe had a good idea, so I thought people struggle with this. It impacts them in this way. It makes them feel gross. It may, whatever. Didn't work to quantify it or deeply understand it. And further, I didn't work to deeply understand the root cause that was creating the problem in the first place. Because if you think you're solving a problem, but you don't hit on the root, at best, you have a painkiller and not something that will actually solve the problem long term. So problem, impact of the problem, root cause of the problem, then innovate.
So good. So good. Collin Graves, innovation is simplifying. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Loved it, Jared. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care. Thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to get more insights from innovators across the world. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional content and conversation. I hope to see you there. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.